So our next speaker is Rebecca Fucci. Rebecca is VP of Research at Fresh Intelligence. She was formerly at Ipsos ASI for 13 years, so she's going to talk about putting it all together, traditional and all the new good stuff. I didn't get a personal fact about you, Rebecca, although I can see that she has excellent taste in colors. So we can start with that. So Rebecca, please come up and talk to us.
Thank you so much. All right, my goal is to not drink someone else's water. There's tons of water down here. All right, so hello everyone and welcome to day one. I actually want to start off today by just telling you a quick story. Have any of you heard of Ames? Oh, wow, there's some big-time Ames shoppers over here. Well, for those of you who haven't heard of Ames, Ames is actually a chain of retail discount stores. And they're based actually in Connecticut, which happens to be where I live. And at its peak, Ames was actually the fourth largest retail discount store in the United States. They had over 700 stores, so they were everywhere. But in 2002, they went bankrupt. And a big part of their bankruptcy was actually due to the fact of their credit lending policy. It was just ridiculous. They were giving credit to pretty much anyone who wanted it, including people that already owed them a crap load of money. But the point of my story is not about their bankruptcy. What I want to talk to you about is my personal experience with Ames. So I actually grew up in Vermont. And where I grew up in Vermont, for those of you who have been there, there's more trees and cows than there actually are people. But I was really lucky because I happened to live in a place where Ames was just a couple of miles away from my house. And the reason I was lucky is the next closest department store was actually 45 minutes away. So I was constantly at Ames. I would go there on a weekly basis, spending my hard-earned babysitting money there. But if you were to ask me how I felt about Ames, this is actually the reaction you'd get. So not exactly the face that you would want associated with your brand. And I'm actually not going to go into the reason behind that face because it's a little embarrassing, but it does involve a scar that to this day I have on my bum. But what I do want to talk about is the fact that the reason behind this whole story is that you would think, based on my behavior, that I was actually a loyalist. But the truth is I wasn't. In fact, the day I turned 16 and got my own car, I would actually make that 45-minute trek to that department store rather than set foot in Ames. So really what I'm talking about is that if you want to measure true loyalty, you need to look at the emotion, the feeling, and not just look at the behavior. Because it's really emotion that drives everything that we do. And this is actually a quote that I think was in one of Steve's neuromarketing books, but it's by Antonio Damasio. And really what he's talking about here is the fact that as humans, we're not thinking machines. We're actually feeling machines that just happen to think. And we need to keep that in mind, because when we're talking to our customers, we need to really consider what is it that our customers are feeling. And so if we're looking at building this relationship with our customers, we need to really start at that basic foundation. So the first thing we fundamentally need to do is make sure that we're offering the basic satisfaction. Otherwise, they're not going to buy our brand or they're going to stop using us. And then, of course, we do want that type of behavior that is acting like loyalty, where they are using our brand frequently, where they are shopping with us a lot. But then ultimately, what we really want is we want those loyalists to become those vocal advocates, because word of mouth has continuously shown us that the key to really brand growth is to have those vocal advocates, to have that word of mouth. And really unlocking what your customers are feeling, that's what's going to give you those vocal advocates. So let me show you a case study here. This is an example. This is for an actual client. It's a loyalty card program. So you know what I'm talking about here, like airlines, credit cards, stores, they all have those loyalty card programs. So in this particular loyalty card, it had a pretty good position in the marketplace. But when we talk to their customers, they're frequent card holders, they were constantly using the cards, and what we found is that even among these frequent users, 1 in 4 of them plan to discontinue using the card within that year. 1 in 4. That's a lot. So what you're seeing on this scatter plot is pretty much just a hot mess. There's dots everywhere. There's really not a strong linear relationship between the people that have used the card in the last week and the percent who plan to discontinue using the card. And the reason it's important to think about that scatter plot, what that was really showing us is the fact that behavioral data, even when you're talking to your satisfied customers or even customers who might actually be frequent shoppers, it doesn't matter because that's not a true predictor of loyalty. What you need to keep in mind is that if you focus on share of heart, you are going to get that share of wallet. But the reverse is not always true. In fact, if you focus on just share of wallet, that can be a really dangerous game. So what you need to do is really just keep in mind matters of the heart. And that's really important because it's the emotional side of the decision-making process that's really given the most weight. I mean, we like to think as customers that we're making decisions based on those cognitive thought processes, that we're using all that information that we're getting, that we're making rational choices based on facts. But the reality is, more often than not, we're making decisions based on emotional habits and past experiences. So the way it works is that our emotions are unconsciously associated with past experiences that might guide or bias our decision making. And this is something called somatic markers. So somatic markers is actually a hypothesis developed by Antonio Damasio. And what this is all about is the somatic markers allow us to really classify stimulus as either good or bad. And what these somatic markers do is that they create this instant reaction in our brain that allows us to bypass that complex cognitive thought process. So for example, if you have a somatic marker that is associated with a positive outcome, then what's going to happen is your brain is going to retrieve kind of happy feelings. That's going to motivate you to want to take action. Or when that somatic marker is associated with a negative outcome, then you might feel really sad or you're uncertain and you're not going to want to pursue that activity. In fact, you might have like alarm signals going off in your brain telling you to avoid a particular activity. Now, I'm sure Antonio Damasio did not have my dog in mind when he came up with this theory, but when I hear about those warning signals going off in your head, what I happen to think about is when I was visiting my in-laws once, my puppy was with me and it was horrible, but my dining room chair crushed her tail. She screamed out in so much pain, both of us were traumatized. Now fast forward 6 years later, and my dog refuses to go into my in-laws' house. It doesn't matter how many cookies I bribe her with, she will avoid that house at all costs. But the reality is, I'm the one that hurt her. The house had nothing to do with it, but her somatic markers are going off. She associates that house with that negative experience, and she will completely avoid it. Now, as humans, where these somatic markers really come in is they prevent us from having some kind of drawn-out meltdown when we're faced with making decisions. So imagine you're at the grocery store and you're gonna pick what kind of jam to buy. So you're there in the aisle and you're standing in front of all of these different variations of jam. Now, if you're gonna make a decision on which to buy just based on cognitive processing, it's going to take you a while because you need to take all of those factors into account, all those different jam variables like, flavor, taste, texture, what the price is, what the size of the jar is, whether it has high sugar content, what the calories are, if it's organic, if it has antioxidants, all those different jam variables. By the time you've processed what the best combination is for you, well, the store's probably going to close. Or what happens if that combination that you think is the best one doesn't even exist? So this is where somatic markers can really come in handy, because what it's going to do is bypass a lot of that crazy complex thinking that's going on in your head and just allow you to make a really quick decision and really feel good about it and allow you to really commit to that decision. Now, the trick for us as marketers is, how do we get consumers to tell us what they're feeling? Because emotions are really difficult to articulate. So one way around that is actually through visual self-report. So what we can do is actually have consumers show us what they're feeling by picking certain visuals, and this allows them to show us in a much quicker, less processed way. Now, what we do at Fresh Intelligence is we actually will show consumers a mix of visuals that have both positive and negative emotions, and we'll surround your brand by these emotions and have consumers pick which emotions they feel not only about your brand, but also about the competitive set. So this is how we get to that emotional piece. But then, separately, this is where we let the rational part of their brain join in on the fun. What we're doing here is we're actually going to ask consumers about past experiences with the brand. We'll ask them whether they agree or disagree with certain product ratings, about touch points such as advertising that they might have seen. We'll talk to them about whether they would recommend the brand to family or friends. So we're getting all that cognitive information. And then that's where the magic happens, because what we then can do is use a regression analysis to really help explain what those emotional drivers and barriers of usage are. So you'll notice that those are two separate things that we're doing. We wouldn't want to ask people what they're feeling and then explain why, because the thing is, consumers a lot of times, they don't know why they're feeling a certain thing. So what we're doing is basically, with this modeling, we're taking that cognitive information and modeling to have it explain what it is, those emotions that they're feeling. So that's going to help us get the whys behind those emotions. So remember that scatter plot I showed you up front where it was just a hot mess? Well, this right here is actually that same exact case example, but what I did is we replaced the behavioral data with the emotional data. And now what you're seeing is a much stronger linear relationship. So in this particular example, you definitely are seeing that the emotion is really helping explain that behavior or the actual loyalty a lot better. So one of the metrics we look at is actually called the Emotional Engagement Index. And this is one score that is taken into account all those different emotions that they told us they were feeling about your brand. And the benefit of that one number is you can easily, as a marketer, just track and see how you're doing over time in terms of your emotional engagement. The fact that it's an index, that's another important part, because what you're doing here is we are comparing your score to the competitive set. So if you have an emotional engagement index of 100, that means that you are completely at average to where your competitive set is. But if you're at 130, then you really have some loyal customers there, and you're doing something really well, and you should keep doing those types of activities. But if you actually have an emotional engagement index that is a 70 or lower, then something's going on. You need to understand, why are your consumers not really engaged with you? And you need to learn how and what to do about that. So this is actually another case study I want to show you. We actually had a client who was using the Net Promoter Score, and they wanted to know, how does our emotional engagement index fit in with that? So what we did here is layer in the two. And what you can see is that the emotional engagement index, so over on the right side where it's above a 130, had really high promoter score. And then on the flip side, you saw that the emotional engagement index under a 70 really had a high level of those detractors in it. So overall, we're seeing really good synergies between the two. But where the emotional engagement index can go a step further is really help you understand the whys and what's going on there. So in this case example, the client had an emotional engagement index that was less than a 70. So their customers really weren't all that engaged. So what we did is we took a look at what those individual emotions were that were rolling up into that score. And what we saw was that levels of pride compared to the competitive set really weren't that great. There was actually low levels of happiness as well, high levels of confusion, and really high levels of skepticism there. And what we were able to do using that regression analysis is able to explain to the marketing team what was causing that skepticism so that they actually knew what was driving that feeling and they could take steps that we were able to provide from them from the data that we had in terms of what to do about it to combat that skepticism. So really the bottom line is that if you want to measure loyalty, what you need to do is really measure the feeling that's driving that behavior. You can't just look at the behavior itself.
You're done on time?
I'm done on time.
Great. So Rebecca had a lot to say that is bridging this gap between traditional and moving towards new emotional research. Any questions for her on that process? There must be one out there. If not, I have one. Yes, the gentleman there in the blue shirt. And mics are coming, I believe. Are mics coming for the questions? Yes, we have a mic sprinter sprinting gracefully. That gentleman there. Mm-hmm.
Than positive. Have you done similar analysis on your emotional engagement score and whether it can drive uptake as opposed to merely predict leaving?
Yeah, and in fact, it was created and used mostly for the uptake part, looking at the positive. So it just happens to be that case example I showed you was based on the negative, because most of what we do is not about that negative. We typically are looking at the positive. Well, if anyone else has any questions, definitely feel to email me, and we can continue the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca.